I am 79 years old, and on the 14th of February, 2 years ago, my heart stopped for 12 minutes inside a small hospital in Kokomo, Indiana. I did not see darkness. I did not feel fear. The very first thing I felt was a warmth I had spent my entire life searching for, without knowing I was searching for it. And in those 12 minutes, Jesus Christ, the same Jesus I had read about in a worn King James Bible since I was a boy growing up in this part of Indiana, he let me hold the son I never knew I had. A 33-year-old man who looked at me with my own father's eyes and said, "Dad, I know. If you have ever carried a grief so deep you didn't know what to name it, if you have ever lived with a loss you couldn't explain or justify or lay down, please stay. Sit with me for a while. What I am about to tell you changed everything I thought I understood about mercy. And if you feel led to stay until the end, to become part of this quiet community of people who are learning together to face eternity without fear, I would be honored to have you here. Subscribe if you want to keep walking this road together. What I have to tell you is not a theory. It is not a theology lesson. It is something that happened to me, and I have spent every day since trying to figure out how to give it to you properly, how to hand it to you the way you hand someone something fragile and irreplaceable. February in Indiana does not arrive gently. It comes in sideways, cold and certain, pressing itself against every window like it owns the house. That February, I was living alone in the same 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, where my wife Edna and I had spent the better part of 40 years together. She had made that house beautiful. She had known how to fill a room with warmth that had nothing to do with the furnace. After she passed in the spring of 2018, I had let the house grow quiet in all the ways she never would have allowed. I was not well, and I knew I was not well. I had known it for months. The way you sense a tire going flat before you hear the sound. A low, persistent wrongness in the chest. A tiredness that 8 hours of sleep never touched. My cardiologist, a serious young man named Dr. Shelton, who always looked slightly alarmed when he reviewed my charts, had told me in November that my heart was functioning at 40% capacity. He said it carefully, the way you deliver a grade to a student who has failed. I drove home from that appointment on Route 31, and I remember thinking, 40% of what? Of the life I was supposed to have lived? Because if that was the measure, then I had spent the other 60% of my life carrying something I never dealt with, never fully named, until a letter arrived in a plain white envelope in the spring of 2010. That letter was from a woman named Ruth, who lived in Sacramento. Ruth was the sister of Clara Hadley, a woman I had loved briefly and completely in the autumn of 1969, when both of us were 23 years old, and the world still had the quality of something that hadn't fully decided what it was going to be yet. Clara and I met at a church social in October, and by December, something had formed between us that I did not yet have the words or the courage to define. She left in January of 1970. I did not ask why. I let her go the way young men let things go when they are too proud to ask the right questions. I told myself she had simply changed her mind about me, and I buried the whole thing under work and silence and the sawdust of the carpenter's shop, where I spent the next 40 years of my life. 40 years later, Ruth wrote to tell me that Clara had been pregnant when she left. She had been afraid of her family's judgment, afraid of what people would say, afraid of all the things that fear finds to be afraid of when you are 23 and facing something alone. She had gone back to California and she had a son, a boy she named Daniel James Hadley, born in September of 1970. Daniel, Ruth wrote, had been a kind man, a school teacher in Sacramento who loved woodworking and maps and the Sacramento River at dawn. He had died of a brain tumor in the spring of 2003 at 33 years old. He had known about me. He had thought about reaching out more than once. He had never done it. I read that letter at my kitchen table while a cup of coffee went cold beside me, and I felt the floor of my life give way in a way it never had. Not in Korea when the shelling was close. Not when the doctor sat down across from Edna and me and used the word terminal. I had a son. I had a son for 33 years, and I had been alive the whole time, breathing in Indiana, 40 miles from an airport, never getting on a plane, not knowing. I had a son, and now I did not. The grief that came from that letter was unlike any grief I had a language for. It was not sharp like the grief of sudden loss. It was wide. It was like discovering a room in your house that had always been sealed, opening the door for the first time and finding it full of everything you should have loved and never got to. In the years after, I thought about Daniel every single day, whether he had my hands, the particular shape of them, the way the knuckles had thickened from years of work, whether he rubbed the back of his neck when he was thinking hard, the way I always had, whether he had liked the smell of sawdust, whether he had ever stood at the edge of something vast, a mountain, an ocean, the Sacramento River in full spring flood, and felt that specific ache of smallness that I had always loved without knowing why. I prayed about all of it, though my prayers felt like letters sent to an address I was not certain of. By February of that year, I had stopped fighting the decline. I had stopped eating with any real intention, stopped taking my daily walks, stopped maintaining the house the way Edna always insisted we maintain it. I was sitting in an armchair near the front window the morning it happened. The light was gray and thin. There was a cardinal on the fence outside, a red one, the color almost violent against the white of the yard. And I was looking at that bird and thinking that even that much beauty felt far away from me now when the pressure came. A heaviness in the chest, not sharp, not dramatic, just a slow and total certainty. The sound of the room began to recede, the way a radio station fades when you drive away from a city. The cardinal blurred at the edges. The armchair beneath me felt very far below. And then there was nothing at all. What came next is the part I have tried to describe 100 times and fallen short 100 times. Because the language we have was built for ordinary things, and this was not ordinary. But I will try again, because you deserve the attempt. The first thing was the absence of pain, not a gradual easing, an absolute and instantaneous removal, as though pain had been a coat I had been wearing so long I had forgotten it was on my body, and it was simply gone. The second thing was a silence, not empty, not hollow, but full. Full the way a held breath is full. Full the way the moment before music begins is full. And then there was light. I call it light because I have no other word. But every light I had ever seen in my 79 years, the August sun coming through the high windows of the shop, the fluorescent hum of hospital corridors, the lamp on Edna's nightstand, every one of them was a copy of a copy of a copy of what I was now moving toward. This light did not overwhelm. It did not blind or startle. It welcomed the way a porch light welcomes you when someone inside has been watching for you and is glad you have arrived. I understood, not with my mind, but somewhere far deeper than my mind, that this was what the word holy had always been attempting to describe. Every time it was spoken in church or in prayer, or in the small and private moments of a long life, when something breaks through the ordinary and you know briefly that you are not alone. I moved without walking. There was direction, intention, and arrival all at once, without friction. The cold of Indiana February, the cold that had lived in my bones for months, was gone completely. Replaced not by the surface warmth of a heated room, but by something that came from the center of everything outward. The warmth of being completely known and not found lacking. I passed through something I cannot name except to call it a threshold, a membrane, a place where the nature of what surrounds you changes the way the nature of the water changes when you cross from shallow into deep. And when I emerged on the other side, I understood with a clarity I had never possessed on earth, that I had spent my entire life breathing in a world that was a shadow of something, and now I was standing in the thing that had cast it. He was there. I will not qualify that statement. I will not soften it or build a careful theological frame around it. He was there the way gravity is there, not always visible, but felt in every particle of everything that exists. Jesus, and the quality of his presence, the thing that undid me more completely than any of the other astonishments of that place, was this: he was glad I was there. Not tolerant of my presence, not patiently enduring something difficult. He was glad, with a joy that was specific to me, to Harold Mercer of Kokomo, Indiana, retired carpenter, broken father, tired old man who had let his house go quiet. And that specificity was itself the miracle I had never been able to believe in while I was living. Because all my life I had believed, distantly and imperfectly, that God might be generally kind to humanity in the aggregate. I had not truly believed, down in the place where belief actually lives, that he was specifically, individually, personally glad about me. The life review came not as a courtroom, but as something closer to a conversation. Someone who had been present at every moment of my life, who understood each one of those moments more completely than I had understood them while living them. I saw moments from my childhood I had not thought about in 50 years. I saw the faces of people I had hurt through carelessness and through silence, and through the particular damage that comes from never saying the right thing at the time it needed to be said. And I felt the weight of each one, not as condemnation, but as seeing clearly at last, as if I were finally able to see the full shape of something I had only ever glimpsed the edges of. And then I saw Daniel. He came toward me across something I can only call a field, though it was also a garden and a forest, and an ocean of air that breathed with living light, all of it at once and without contradiction. He was 33 years old, the age he had been when he died, and there was no illness in him, no trace of what had taken him. He wore a blue shirt, the color of a summer morning over Indiana, and he had my father's jaw, my father's particular way of carrying his shoulders. And when he looked at me, the recognition between us was instantaneous and total. The way you recognize a song you learned in childhood and have not heard in 40 years, straight to the heart without passing through the mind. I said his name. I said Daniel, and he said, "Dad, I know." He said it without accusation, without grief, without the weight of all the years of silence between us. He said it with a completeness that answered every question I had carried for 12 years, answered them all at once, and left nothing remaining but the simple and overwhelming fact of our being together. I held him. I held my son. And the grief that had lived in me since the day that letter arrived, the grief with no bottom, for the voice and the face and the years I never got to know, was not erased. It was answered. There is a critical difference. Erasure leaves nothing. An answer gives you something you did not have before, something that is now permanently yours. What I received in that embrace was the understanding that love does not require physical proximity in order to be real. That Daniel had been known and loved even before I knew he existed, because love at that level does not depend on human awareness for its reality. Jesus was present through all of it, not observing from a distance, but present the way light is present, constituting the very atmosphere of the encounter. And when Daniel stepped back and looked at me with those eyes that held my father's steadiness and Clara's warmth in equal measure, I understood that I was not being handed a consolation prize for what I had missed. This was the real thing. This was what had always been true, seen now without the interference of time and flesh and human misunderstanding. There was a peace in me then, deeper than anything I had ever called peace in my earthly life. The peace Paul writes about, the peace that surpasses understanding. And I finally knew in that place exactly what he had been trying to tell us. And then I knew it was not my time. Not a voice exactly, not a command, but a knowing, gentle and absolute simultaneously. The way the most important truths always seem to arrive. There is more for you to carry back. What I felt in that moment was not relief. I want to be honest about that. I did not want to return. Every part of whatever I was in that place wanted to remain. In the light, in the warmth, in the presence that was the origin of every good thing I had ever briefly touched in my best moments of prayer and gratitude on earth. The thought of returning to the cold house, the silent bedroom, the failing body, the days that had grown increasingly empty, there was grief in that prospect, real grief. I looked at Daniel one last time. He was calm, at rest in a way I understood was not temporary or fragile, but permanent and secure. He raised one hand, a small gesture, a see you soon, unhurried and certain. And then the warmth began to pull back, and the light began to recede. And I felt the weight of a body returning, the weight of lungs filling, of a chest that hurt, of air forced into a space that had been still. And then there was sound and cold and a ceiling above me, and a young nurse saying, "Mr. Mercer, can you hear me?" And I was back in Kokomo, Indiana, and it was still February. I spent 11 days in that hospital, most of them very quiet. The cardiologist explained the cardiac event, the resuscitation, the pacemaker they had placed. He used good, careful medical language, and I listened with the surface of my attention, while the deeper part of me remained standing in that field, where my son had walked toward me in his blue shirt. I think some part of me will always be standing there, and I have made my peace with that. Here is what I was sent back to tell you. The grief you carry for the people you lost, for the time that passed, for the children you did not get to hold or know or be truly known by. That grief is real, and it is not small, and I will not pretend otherwise. But it is not the last word. What I saw in those 12 minutes is that love is more persistent than time, more persistent than death, more persistent than the silences and failures and distances of an ordinary human life. Daniel knew he was loved. Jesus knew. And the grace that was extended to me in that field was not earned. It was not the reward for sufficient years of correct Christian living. It was grace precisely because it was given freely, without condition, because that is the nature of the one who gives it, and that nature does not change based on whether you have been watching closely or not. I am 79 years old, and I am not afraid to die. I want to say that plainly, not because I am indifferent to life. I have loved it more fiercely in the 2 years since that February than I did in any of the decades before it, but because I have stood in the presence of Jesus Christ, and I have held my son, and I know with every cell of this old and imperfect body that what waits on the other side of our last breath is not darkness, not silence, not the cold absence of everything. What waits is a love so specific, so personal, so individually and joyfully particular to who you are and who you have always been in the sight of God, that you will never again be able to use the word grace casually. I leave you with this, friend. However the grief found you, whatever closed door you have stood outside of for too long, the one who stands on the other side is not keeping it locked. He is waiting for you to understand that it never was.